Hello, my name is Hamlet Dobbins, and this is Memphis Material, an oral history project chronicling the stories of the visual arts in Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis Material is a podcast celebrating the personal histories, the intimate stories, and the studio practices of some of the people who help shape the creative landscape of our city. These unedited interviews are all recorded at the Memphis Listening Lab, an archival gem located in the majestic Crosstown Concourse in beautiful downtown Memphis. Sorry, that was me channeling Roman Mars a little bit too hard. It's actually in beautiful Midtown Memphis. The archive and the website are designed by the wonderful Brian Dixon. And again, we don't really have sponsors for these shows, but if we were to pretend that we did, today's episode is sponsored by poetry. So a million years ago, when I turned 50, I got a porch swing from my partner. And that same year, as was sort of the usual for me, my sister, Heather, who is a wonderful poet, gave me a couple of books of poetry. And I did the same thing that I always do. I sit down and I read a couple of poems, and then I say, oh man, that was great. I'm going to have to read the rest of those someday. And then I put a little bookmark in them, and then I put them on the shelf. And I looked at the shelf, and I realized that that shelf, actually two shelves, was this really beautifully, wonderfully curated collection of poetry books. Almost all of them had been given to me by my sister over the years for Christmases and birthdays, and just because she had them and she wanted to share them. And so I realized that since I was 50, I needed to go ahead and read them. Otherwise, I wasn't going to read them. And so I sat down and started this Poetry on the Porch project. And I started reading these poems. And for me, one of the things that was really wonderful and powerful about this particular project was that it gave me, well, there were a couple of rules. One of the rules was that I was just going to read these like small books, like basically the poet's version of an album. And so sometimes you'll go into the bookstore and you'll see books of poetry, and it'll be like the complete poems of Pablo Neruda, or it'll be the new and selected poems by Lucille Clifton or whatever. And so I didn't want to read any of those because I know how important it is for poets to be in control of the order and the pacing and the spacing of the poems. And so I made one of the rules. One of the rules was that no collected works, no anthologies, just these basically like an album. And for me, it was really wonderful in terms of thinking about how to organize work, mostly because I know my sister and her partner sort of labor for months and months to try and figure out the right order for these poems that are going to be in a book. And reading these poems have brought me a huge amount of love and empathy and understanding of the world that I did not have before. So today's episode sponsored by poetry. Now, today's interview is part one of two interviews that I did with the wonderful Melissa Dunn. And I've known Melissa Dunn, like a lot of these people, for a long time. And so several years ago, my mom was ill. She had cancer and had gone through chemo, and we were making the drive across Arkansas to visit with my sister. And I told my mom, I was like, well, I'm doing this project. And recently I sat down with Melissa. And my mom loved Melissa and her husband, James Brooks. And I was like, do you want to listen to this interview that I did with Melissa? And she was like, yeah. And so we listened to this interview as we drove across Arkansas to go to Fort Smith. And it was really great in that at the end, my mom said, I feel like I know Melissa a lot more now. And for me, that's the reason I do these interviews, in part to hold the stories, but also in part to help us understand some people who we only know through their work or maybe only know peripherally, And then also, full disclosure, when Melissa and I met for the second interview, we talked at great length about the contents of this interview. A lot of it is really personal information. I'm not totally sure that Melissa was ready for these questions. Really, it just not necessarily the questions, but just sort of the line of thinking, the personal history. And I was also sort of seized by the understanding that this is a really beautiful and vulnerable thing that people do when they come in and they share their stories with me and this archive. And so for sure, in the same way that I think each interview is different, for me, this interview with Melissa was a sort of a turning point, or a place of reconsideration, or a place of rethinking of this project. Anyway, all of that laid out. I'm very thankful for Melissa for coming in and talking to us, and then also just for being Melissa. Again, this is one of two interviews with Melissa Dunn. It was recorded on February 24th, 2024. Enjoy the interview.
No. So can you ask me the question again?
Yeah, of course. So usually we start by asking, what's your earliest memory of art in the house?
In the house. Wow. I would say record covers. I listened to a lot of music growing up, and we didn't have a big record collection, but it was a small, it was like the just typical sort of family in the 70s record collection. So I looked at a lot of those. We had...
Give me an example. What are some things that you liked?
Oh, gosh. Well, we had a lot of stock stuff, obviously. We had a lot of, I was really into, well, let me stick to what's in my house first.
Okay, wait, hang on. Okay, so I like how we've already sort of deviated from the path. Okay, so you said a lot of Stax stuff, obviously.
This is too much.
And then some people may not know the story of your connection with Stax.
Well, first I want to say there's a Dick Knowles painting in my house.
When you were a kid?
When I was a kid. And I don't know how they got it. I mean, my parents were not in the art world at all. I mean, the local art. They were not visual artists at all.
What was the painting?
It was a traditional sort of 70s abstract Dick Knowles, and it had a silver frame. And I remember it was in, how there was the living room and the dining room, the separation of those two spaces. And so it was in the living room, and we had a baby blue sort of velvet couch with a glass top table with silver legs, and this Dick Knowles painting with a silver frame. And it was very sort of modern feeling, like my mom had redone the house, and this was in probably 79. And so and I don't know what happened to it. The family split apart, and it got lost in the shuffle somehow.
Do you have any idea how it came into the house?
I don't really know, and I've tried to ask my mom about it, and she just doesn't really know. I mean, like she goes, well, I'm thinking maybe like I got it at Pink Palace, and I'm like, I don't think you probably did, because I doubt if he sold at Pink Palace,
right?
Crafts Fair.
Now, to interrogate your memory, are you sure that it was a Dick Knowles painting?
Well, it may not have been, but I do really feel like it was. I really do feel like it was an actual Dick Knowles painting.
Wouldn't that be great if it wasn't? Wouldn't that be great if it was like, I don't know, just like some anonymous thing, and you, like, all of these years later, you've piled that on there? Okay. Well,
thank you for destroying my show.
I know, right? Okay, so back to the question of the Melissa Dunn Stax connection.
Well, my dad's brother is Doug Dunn, and he played in Booker T and the MGs, and he was part of the Stax house band, and I was 2 years old when Stax broke up. So what I experienced was the people, that generation in their late 30s and 40s, sort of, that was their glory days. Mm-hmm. So that's how I experienced the late 50s and early 60s to mid 60s Memphis music, was through middle-aged people living in that, not letting that go, and just like we all do, you tend to stick where you cut your teeth, and so I grew up around a lot of that.
It's interesting. I mean, I think most of the people that I've interviewed for this, they have a pretty similar path. Most of them are solely active in the arts. Like some people had some theater and had some choir connections and some musical connections, but none, I think, to the extent that you did. And so when you were talking about you were really little when they broke up and you were sort of always surrounded by these people, is your memory of music early on, does that predates your thinking about art?
Yeah, I didn't start thinking about art until I was in college.
Okay.
But I had a creative life, and it was via music, and that was the way I creatively expressed myself, through the act of listening to music with headphones on, by the family stereo in a rocking chair. I was started when I was in second grade, with taping things off the radio.
Okay.
And so I had the radio itself was the key to everything. So the dialing of the channels back and forth, and the finding the song that would transport me into another world. And then also, I think it was in the fourth grade, I had a cousin who, so my dad had 5 brothers and sisters, including Duck. And so they all had children. And it was kind of one of those things of like, I'm the baby cousin. So I have cousins that are the same age as aunts, and it's like all that sort of like long, wide generational thing of like, my grandmother having a kid at 20 and having a kid at 40, and then her kid that she had when she was 20 is having a baby, so it's like that. I grew up around a lot of people, and I was the youngest of the cousins, like I said, and so I was in awe of all these cousins. And one cousin, this woman, Linda Gale Dunn was her name at the time, she looked like Carly Simon. She was like in her early 20s, and she was so pretty. And she had this long, sun-kissed, wavy hair, and she pulled up to our house. I'll never forget, I was in the 4th grade, and she pulled up to our house with her new boyfriend in this convertible MG. And I just had the biggest crush on both of them. I was just like, I've known her my whole life, but suddenly she was this young woman, and she just was so just enchanting to me. And she left a cassette tape, which was a soundtrack to this movie called FM, which was about the rise of FM radio. And I mean, it had Steely Dan and Tom Petty and Lou Reed and all of these 70s sort of people you would find on FM radio, and the lure of FM radio. And so I cut my teeth on FM radio, and at that time, I think it was in 1980. So this was a little before that, but Memphis radio was like, these were like independent radio stations. And these DJs were very much like WYXR in a way, in the sense of like they were curating their own shows. And so it was a really cool time to need an escape, and also have that to be the portal. And it was an escape because go ahead. What are you going to say?
No. One thing I was thinking about was when you were little, you were talking about sort of looking at record albums. Was there an awareness in your brain at the time that the art itself was interesting, or was it mostly the music and then the art?
It was not a thinking thing. It was a feeling thing. So I wasn't thinking about anything. I was just absorbing everything. I was absorbing television. I was absorbing I was absorbing magazines. I was absorbing record covers. I was absorbing everything, And on the one hand, I, you know, my childhood was like chaotic, very chaotic.
And what was it that made it so chaotic?
Alcoholism.
Okay.
So, and on the one hand, like my parents were like gorgeous and fashionable. My mom was like this 6 foot tall, model-esque, very beautiful woman. And my dad was the life of the party. And so I kind of grew up in this environment of just being lots of activity and lots of dancing and lots of music and lots of this, but also a lot of drunk people. And my parents, I was the third kid, they were pretty checked out most of my life. And were very checked out. And as a child. And I struggled in school. Like from the time I got to school, like, I dissociated constantly. And I would do it through music. And so, I would mark out all my homework with a big fat marker. I'd tear out pages. I would just try to destroy the work and just be like, I don't know how to do it. And it wasn't until, so that FM tape, was kind of like a world unto itself, because it was this soundtrack that was like, oh, wow. And I just listened to it over and over and over and over again. And then by the time I was in high school, I was living in an internalized fantasy world that was, later I realized that there's this term called maladaptive daydreaming, which is actually a condition that people have where they daydream so much that it interferes with their life. And I literally lived in a fantasy world for my whole childhood, mostly up until I was finally, and I barely passed every year.
Now, what was the daydream world like?
It was mostly about boys. It was very, very, very much just a young girl who wasn't, getting the sort of her needs being met. It was like a world where I was just in a world of, I would like see movies like that would take place in Ireland, and I'd spend a year in Ireland. Or there was this movie called Zuma Beach with Suzanne Summers, and and it was a surfer movie, kind of like a la Fast Times at Ridgemont High type thing. And I just was like in that world for a long time. And then I remember as a very little kid, like a little kid, like seeing Sesame Street and seeing like a city block with a stoop. And I was just fascinated with that. And I was like, I want to live in a city block with a stoop, So the pop culture and TV gave me locations. And then the rest was just like regular, like high school, grade school, high school, just me coming of age in my body and me learning how to, just grab someone's attention. It was all about that. It was like really nothing. It wasn't the content of the daydreams wasn't that fascinating, but it was like a typical young girl.
Now, what do you think? So like you were saying that your interest in art really didn't happen until college, but what about like the making? What about not necessarily making art, but visual art, but what about music? Were you making music, or were you thinking about how your music might sound or how your work might be?
I would say that I had a lot of issues with like just arrested development. So like I didn't really start developing in any kind of way until I was out of the house. So I did start playing guitar when I was in 7th grade. I went to Catholic schools, and you know, my parents are like classic white flight situation. One grew up in North Memphis, one grew up in South Memphis, and they were working class. Their parents were cab drivers, farmers, completely blue collar. Then that generation, my parents' generation, and my aunts and uncles became white collar. And then my generation became college educated. And so what happened was they moved out to East Memphis, converted from Baptist to Catholicism soon after they had children, so they could send us to Catholic schools. And when I was going to Catholic schools, I went to St. Louis and then St. Agnes here in Memphis, is that, you could send 3 kids to a Catholic school then on a salesman's budget, or salary, I mean. My mom didn't work. So we all went to these Catholic schools. And I would say the Catholic Church was artistically, like a very, very inspiring place.
And then, so you were talking about your mom stayed at home. What was she creative? Did she make things?
Not really, no. She was creative in her look. She was very much into clothes, and she was very into like presentation, and she made our home. She was really good interior designer, I would say. So aesthetics meant something to her. Beauty meant something to her. And same with my dad. They like to cook. They like to, my dad was the kind of guy who would, he wanted to have a Mercedes, but he couldn't get the new one, so he'd get a 10-year-old one. He wanted nice things. They were into aesthetics. They were into beauty. And they were, I'm painting a picture of my parents as like, it's a one-dimensional thing. This is just, as we, so they're fully dimensional people who, my dad went into recovery, and, my mom is still with me and I take care of her, so there's a whole other side to that story. But I don't think they ever really knew how much I struggled as a kid, needing help with school and things like that. All of that I taught myself once I left home. So, but going back to your question, they were, they were not college educated people. They were people who, dance was very important to them. Music was very important to them. And, I got a lot from absorbing that. And then, but going back to my music, so when I was growing up in this Catholic environment, which, I questioned from a very early age. And there's a lot I could say about how that was a positive and a very negative influence on me. But on a positive note, it was a time in the Catholic Church where Vatican II had just happened in the 60s. So things had really changed. And it was a lot about tending to the poor. And it was a lot about that kind of just really helping people. My mom did a lot of work with immigration in Memphis. Immigration was a thing of it's such an antithetical to what it is now. It was Catholic Charities. I have a picture of me in the 6th grade at the airport meeting Vietnamese families in the early 1970s with all of my classmates, and my mom was put all that together, So my parents were doing things within that context that was inspirational to me on the one hand. And so I've spent a lot of time in that world. And another aesthetic thing about the Catholic Church was that in the 70s there was the hippie mass, which was in the morning. Certain masses were high end with the choir and all that, but then there was the acoustic guitar 25-year-old hippies up there, and that's what I locked into. And that's how I started learning to play guitar, was those kids taught me how to play guitar. And so I play at church and everything. I wasn't, and one of my brothers played guitar, and I had a cousin who played guitar, and so I was like the next generation. Like we were all kind of little guitar players, you know. Yeah, go ahead.
So just a couple of things.
Sure.
One, I just want to mention that you're the first person to mention Vatican II. Also, the first person to mention Suzanne Summers in this interview series. So way to go. Okay, so
I'm dating myself.
I know. Well,
Listen, this is the way it is. Come on.
Okay, so to back up just a little tiny bit, and so you were saying your dad was a salesman.
Well, so he dropped out of high school in the 10th grade.
Okay.
And he worked for Gray Bar Electric as a truck driver. And this was the late 50s. And him and my mom met in high school. And in the early 60s, so my mom tells this story of like how all they did in their late, like after high school, before they had kids, like in their 24. So they had a good 6 years of being together. And their whole thing was like where they could go dance every night. They could go to the VFW hall one night. They could go to Plantation Inn in Arkansas one night. They could go here one night, depending on their age and all of that. But that was the whole thing was like, where could they go dance? And so Duck was a few years younger than my dad. And so when all that happened, you know, my dad had a bar for about a year, like over by Crump Stadium called Rafters, and my mom would run the door. And, you know, so that was a whole scene. Like they were very much a part of like the Memphis music scene, 1956 to 1964. I would say, I say 64 because that's when my brother was born, and that's when probably things changed.
Now, do you think, like you had also mentioned the Dick Knowles painting in the house, were there other things that were art in the house that you remember? And then also, did you go out and see music with your parents? Or was performance a part of the story too?
No, performance wasn't. I didn't really go see music. Well, we would go see Duck. Like, for example, like I remember going to see the Blues Brothers when they came through town, because, you know, that was a big deal at the time. And so, but he wasn't, you know, but I did start. Well, let me go back to your first question. The first question about is what other things were in the house. I mean, there was a lot of. My mom was into watercolors, so there would be little watercolors around. There would be tchotchkes. She really liked tchotchkes, you know, so little things around. And, you know, I would spend a lot of time going through my parents' drawers. You know, like I was a snoop. I went through everything. And I just like to sort. I like to pull everything out, put it back in. I like to go through my dad's coins and that plastic tray that would be in the drawer that had the compartments. I don't know if your dad had one. And, you know, and it was I mean, I would go through everything, you know. I go through cabinets. I was a weird little kid, you know, and I don't think they had any idea I was doing any of those things. But what was great was I had two older brothers, and my parents were very social. So I was not. So from a very young age, my parents, Saturday night, they would go get me a Happy Meal, come bring it home. And we'd have babysitters when we were younger, but then I hit this pretty young age, and they would leave me home alone on a Saturday night. Was my favorite thing in the world, just to have the house to myself. I did that a lot. And I spent a lot of time in my house by myself, and I loved it.
Now, what would you do on a Saturday night by yourself?
I would listen to music,
okay,
real loud, and dance. And I'd watch. My dad was really into getting we were the first person who had a microwave. We were the first person who got cable TV. So I was watching Max from a very young age. I was watching stuff I should not have been watching because nobody was around, you know. The thing about neglect. Or parent, you know, maybe neglect's a harsh word, but the thing about having parents just sort of in their own world is you get to do whatever you want. It's for better or for worse, you know. So I was, you know, and then I don't know. I mean, then I went to being in parochial schools, and then I went to an all-girl Catholic high school, which was not a good fit for me at all. I mean, I got on with people okay. Like, I went to a high school class reunion once, and I was like, all these pictures, everybody had all these pictures up on this board, and there was all this stuff. And I was like, I'm not in any of these pictures, these group pictures. And I realized because I was always like on the outside of the crowd, got along well with everybody. I was like the person seemed to get along kind of well with everybody, but I didn't really have a group, you know?
And so what about, like, one of the things that usually comes up in these interviews is people will talk about, or they'll mention art education in some way. Did that spur you when you were in high school? Like, for me, the art room was like the place to be myself and to be left alone and to be safe. What was the art room? Was it present at all in your world?
No. I mean, I like 11th and 12th grade. I mean, this is like embarrassing, but I smoked weed every morning on the way to school. Like, I was a little pothead in high school, which is not good because now I know how bad weed is for the developing brain. And I don't say that with any pride. I say that with like, oh my God, I have to do a lot of inner child work. I've done a lot of inner child work. And I think one reason I want to hammer home the way I was raised and the sort of like the fact that I've done anything with my life is I seriously had to teach myself how to be a human in some ways. Like, I really was lost as a person, you know? And
Now, when did you realize that you were lost? And then also, I'm curious, how does one realize that they need to teach themselves to be a human? Or is that one of those things where, of course, we recognize that, and as the 2024 Melissa who's talking about it, like, is that one of those things that you realize now, or is that one of those things that you realized in the moment?
in the moment, I remember driving to school one day with my mom, and my mom was really into magazines. So we always had like People, Cosmo. We always had good magazines. And so I remember riding to work. She was driving us to school, and there was some fight or some argument happening in the car. A lot of fights, you know. And I clearly remember thinking, well, I know that based on what I see around me and the way other people around me are raised, that I'm not getting the help that I need. And I know that this is probably going to warp my brain a little bit. All these things that I'm doing, this escapism, all the things, like, I'm aware of it, but I'm going to put that on hold. And when I get to be an older person, I'm going to go to therapy. Which I did.
Well, I mean,
but I knew as a kid that, like, I knew that I was in a sort of a damaged frame of mind, but that I could attend to it at another future date.
How did you know this? Because, I mean, as a person who has a similar timeline as you, therapy wasn't anything that I thought about until I was in college. How as a kid were you aware of that?
Cosmopolitan.
Ah, okay.
Cosmo, dude. I mean, therapy was big in those women's magazines. Like, it was very trendy, you know, like psychoanalysis and all of that, you know. I mean, it was like the age of Woody Allen, you know, and you know, all those movies of just like self-actualization, you know, that was a big thing, you know. And so I knew that I had some work to do. But just to give another side to it, like, there was a freedom there that was great. Like, I was really able to, you know, I just absorbed everything. I was just a sponge, you know. And there was some point I think that some of it had to do with getting television so young, cable so young, and like watching the dawn of MTV, for example, and seeing and discovering music outside of that FM radio, like about a junior or senior in high school. And I started hanging out with like my first, like I didn't really date anybody until I was a senior in high school and he was 24. Like that's another example. Like my first boyfriend was 24 and I was like, oh, that's fine. Nobody, like, why didn't anybody say maybe this is a problem? But anyways, I digress. He was actually a really nice guy. But I met him waiting in line for, did you ever get to wait in line for concert tickets at Ticket Hub over by the Home Depot?
No, we waited in line for tickets at
Raleigh.
the Raleigh Springs Mall.
Yeah,
yes.
I forgot. Yeah, I forgot that's your. Well, my mom would drop us off and the night before, like eight, like if they would go to sale on Saturday morning, she would drop us off at like 5:00 on Friday night, and we would spend the night, me and a few girlfriends, and it was like that kind of freedom was great, you know, and so. I went to everything. I went to all the concerts, like starting from like, all just like stupid 80s stuff, like Styx and all that, whatever. But some of it was really good. Like, for example, like once I got later in high school, Elvis Costello tickets came on sale. And no, wait, this is what happened. I was in line for Rush tickets. But then Elvis Costello tickets were on sale too. But I didn't really know who Elvis Costello was. But all the cool kids were in Elvis Costello's line. Like, I was like, who are these guys? Like, they were older. They were with skateboards. They had on those corduroy Van shorts. And I was like, who are these guys? Because I was surrounded by, like, Christian Brothers guys. And I'm looking at these guys. I'm like, I want to hang out with them, And so that's how I sort of like, that really opened my world. There was like a radio station at Rhodes at the time. What was that Southwestern station called? Oh gosh, I can't.
WLYX.
That was pivotal. Yeah. Interview Magazine. That was a very visual, like that's how I remember like in high school, like starting, I just remember in high school, like, so MTV, like that's where all this visual, like pop culture, just like I absorbed every ounce of it, Now,
you said absorbed several times, which I love, but what do you think, one of the things I wonder is, what was it that made you such a sponge? What, like, are you just sort of genetically a sponge, or do you think you were a sponge because you were exposed to such a huge variety of things? Like, I wonder, what's the source of your spongeness?
I believe that it's a multi-part. It's several parts to it. It's neurology. Okay. I think some of it is my, I was so in my parents, because my parents were in their world, I was in my world. So I think it was a tactic of survival. I had to be aware of my surroundings. I had to know what was going on around me because I was learning things a lot on my own. Okay. So I would watch a TV show and absorb, and it would seep into me in ways that were on many multiple levels that I didn't understand or know at the time. I mean, all of this is in retrospect. At the time, it was, honestly, having like talked to people and spent time like figuring all this stuff out and like tending to that younger part of myself and sort of help healing a little bit from it, is that I was resilient, and I was figuring stuff out, One other thing I want to say is that was very pivotal for me, and I don't know how this happened, how this really, plays into anything, is that I was born completely cross-eyed, completely, like straight down the middle, strabismus, and had 4 surgeries by the time I was 4, which in the late 1960s was complete anesthesia. They take your eyeballs out, they stretch them, they put them back in. It was very traumatic. Like, my first memory was my dad on the other side of a glass wall, like I was in an operating room, and he was on the other side looking in through this big glass wall. And I remember he had on this blue and white jumper kind of boiler suit. He was very skinny at the time. And my first memory is being pinned down and having gas administered to me, like the stinky gas with the black. That was my first memory. Fast forward years later, I'm reading a book on trauma, And it said in there are called Chasing the Tiger, which is actually a very good book if anybody needs to address some of the things that happened to them when they were a kid. And it said in there certain things in childhood like X, Y, Z, and certain eye surgeries with administration of gas. It was so weirdly specific. I almost dropped the book and went and showed it to my husband and was like, read this. And it clarified things for me. Like somehow having your eyes manipulated and being administered that kind of gas, it somehow does. So I don't know what all of that means exactly, honestly. But, I've talked to my mom about some of this stuff since, and my dad went into recovery. And so I've had, all of this has been, the beauty of it is my dad went into recovery when he was 50. When I was like 18, my mom left my dad. She was waiting until I graduated from high school. And 2 weeks later, she left my dad for a dude she met in Florida on the beach and was having a secret affair with him. And it was traumatizing to our whole family, including my mom eventually. But point being is that was the thing that made my dad hit rock bottom. Is in the part my dad's passed away, so I feel like I can talk about this, and he would want me to. But the beauty of it is that I learned a lot about, like, he told me, he said, when a person starts drinking, that's when their emotional maturity ends as an alcoholic. And I started drinking when I was 15. And I was like, oh, yeah, I was raised by teenagers. This makes total sense now, So I have a lot of forgiveness. I mean, all of this is to say, but I can't explain my art life and I can't explain who I am as a person without saying I struggled as a kid. And it was all through my 20s where I rebuilt myself as a person, really into my 30s, to be honest. I mean, I feel like it was probably about 40 when I was like standing on firm ground in a way that was like very like, okay, here we go. I mean, I can actually think about this. But then, so I couldn't get into U of M. Because I didn't have good enough grades, and I couldn't test. Like, I just didn't know. I had what do they call it? Executive function. I had no executive function. Okay. So I couldn't study. I learned it, but I couldn't do it. And then I feel like I'm just talking and talking. Oh my God, this is how this is, right?
No, this is great. I mean, of course, I am nodding, and you are talking and talking, but it's just because you are so well formed in terms of thinking about the story that I don't really have to do anything.
Okay, good. Well, so what happened was I got into Southwest, which was State Tech at the time. And that was life-changing because I was in a co-ed environment. And I started seeing other people in their homes. Like, I would study with kids and see like their home life. And I was like starting to learn about other people's homes life. Yes, lots of people I went to high school with were going off to college and stuff. But I knew that wasn't in the cards for me. Like, I graduated like second to the bottom of my class. Like, I just considered myself dumb. I considered myself sort of not very smart. Now, I will say this. I did have a teacher in junior year that I loved history. I really could lock into history for some reason, and she saw it. And so she took me on Presidential Classroom and took me to Washington, D.C. And all the other teachers were like, why are you taking her? And so that was great. Like, that was like, she was Miss Ring. She was like the one teacher I had who was like, kind of saw through all the nonsense of what was going on. It was like.
Now, what was it you think that made you lock into history? What was it about it that was particularly interesting to you?
I like to figure out how things work. I like to understand how we got where we are. And I think I was so into pop culture and I was so into like music. It was sort of like, well, how did we get from this to that? And it helped me figure out how I just like to understand how things work. And I also like stories, and I don't know why I like history so much, but
I wonder, I mean, one of the things that I'm curious about is thinking about how, when we were in that moment, how it was that we saw ourselves seeing that thing. You know what I mean? So, like, right now, obviously, 2024 Melissa is talking about it, and like you were saying, this is sort of your thinking about it. But, like, if we were to go back and ask junior year, Melissa, what was it about history? Do you think you had any idea at the time?
I don't know. I mean, I think it was the one thing that came easy. You know, it like I could retain it. I could see conceptual ideas. You know, like I will say this: starting in my junior and senior year, I was starting to find subjects that I could lock into. I was starting to find like for example, trigonometry made a lot of sense to me. Algebra made a lot of sense to me, and I I was starting to realize that, oh, I'm actually kind of good at this. You know, I didn't analyze or understand why. Now I understand why. But at the time, I don't think I could have answered that. I think it's just that I was able to, sequentiality made sense to me, or chronology made sense. I was really interested in like how the world worked, how we got from point A to point B, you know, and I'm still figuring that out. You know, I love why, which is why. Well, go ahead.
Well, back to state tech. So thinking about with state tech, I mean, I think I'm curious to hear more about how seeing other people in their worlds impacted you. And so what was it about that, or what did you notice in particular that was different?
Well, I just remember um, there was this guy. He was kind of a jock, actually, but when we were just friends, and I would go to his house. I think it was like out there by State Tech, and his family life was just so. His home was really calm and peaceful, and I was like, wow, this is just like, this is what I want, you know, and so things like that, and then. I was working at the time too. Like I was working at Kroger and the deli, and I had a little job. And then, but at the same time, my parents were splitting up, and my dad was literally having a complete nervous breakdown. Like he was crying all the time. I mean, it was like I was put in a very difficult position. My brothers were kind of out of the house, and I was there like nursing my dad, and my mom was off finding herself in a way that she just was like, now at the time I did not understand it at all, but now I definitely understand it. It's just like, I cannot do this anymore. I was in the middle of it, and it was very, very fraught. But then my brother David, we went to Zinni's, and he was starting to hang out with Midtown kids, and that's when I started discovering that, like, the world of, I kind of knew Midtown. Like we would go, like my parents, we'd go on pub crawls, and well, hey, listen, I grew up asleep on the floor at Bombay Bicycle Club in Overton Square. Like my parent, like we would go to Midtown, but it was always like a thing, and so by the time I was like that first year at State Tech out of high school, I was going into Midtown more and more, and then discovering like all of these sort of slightly older kids, Misty and Christy White, for example. Like it's a whole world of people, and that's when and they were very artistic and musical. And I just felt a connection. I didn't understand. I didn't say, oh, I'm an artist or anything like that. But then I finally did get into U of M the next year. And I kind of started realizing that I wanted, aesthetically, things started changing. Like I changed my bedroom. I painted it gray, and I was really into new wave, and I was really into punk rock. In my last year of high school, I was listening to the Road Station. I was like I was dating this guy who was 24, who was exposed me to all of this, British music. And I was really starting to find what I wanted. Like my whole senior year of high school I was like piercings and taking them out when I went to school and putting them back in and the whole thing. And then once I got to U of M, I was like, I want to take an art class. And I don't know why I want to take a drawing class. I just feel like that if I could go and take an art class, well, for one thing, I walked into the Tiger Den and there was, Misty White, this incredible, she was just reigning queen of the scene. And I was just like, oh my God, who are all these people, And I just gravitated towards them. And a lot of them were in the art, taking art. And so this was like in the mid 80s. So this was like, because I dropped out and then came back later when I met you. Anyways, so I took a drawing class with Steve Langdon. And I was like, if I make a B, at least a B, then that means I'm as good as people who did it all through high school. And that means I can maybe do this. And I made a B. And that was it. I never turned back. I found my people. I started making better grades. I started making really good grades. I started learning how to study and learning how to do things. I could keep going. Maybe you should ask a question because I could just tell you the whole story. I never talk this much. Like, I'm the person who people talk to and I listen, and I never am the one who does, if I talk too long, I get real rambly feeling, and I don't but people will ramble to me forever. I'm that, Anyway, so this is kind of fun just to be able to tell this story. Because I don't ever hardly tell it.
But I mean, for me, it's funny. I don't remember our interactions when we have lunch together. I seem to remember that it's more of an even thing. I don't.
Well, yeah, you're not. Yeah, I mean, I do have people in my life where there's a balance, but and that you're a very good listener, but obviously because you're doing this. But
well, okay, so hang on, we gotta talk about Steve Langdon
because
I mean, for sure, one of the things that I'm particularly interested in terms of your point of view is that you have a very varied connection to Steve, not just with that one class, but later in life.
Yeah.
We'll get to that stuff later. But I'm super curious too to hear about your experience in that. Was it drawing one?
Mm-hmm. It was drawing one. It was probably 1986, 85.
Okay.
And it was Steve Langdon, and then I took color theory from Larry Edwards, and then I took painting from Dunn. I mean, from who's the painter that we had at the house? His name just left my... Dick Knowles. Oh, my gosh. Also, what was the... Melinda Parsons? Was the art historian there? That was the one that blew my mind wide open. I locked into art history. I locked in to art history because the thing that... any good art historian gives you historical context of what's going on at the time. So I'm learning about... I love history already. I'm obviously realizing that the visual arts matter to me on some level. And that was the moment, I was seeing things in there that just I'm still thinking about and working through and figuring out. And my dad was going to New York. His business, he'd gone from a salesman to owning a manufacturing company in lighting. And he was dealing with people from New York. And my dad was kind of he really actually sort of loved going to New York. And he was kind of a cosmopolitan person, sort of stuck in his world and his life, So he would go to New York a lot at this time. And at 19, we went to New York and we went to MoMA, and I was standing in front of a Cezanne. I was walking through the museum with a bit of understanding of what was going on around me because I was recognizing some of these because I'd taken an art history class. And it was I was crying and I was emotional, and it just gets me emotional thinking about it. It was a visceral reaction of that museum. It was a spiritual experience in the sense that it was something beyond my body. It made me feel connected to something eternal. It was very, very, very deep. And it was a good time with my dad. Because, oh God. He was just, you know, you you have your wounds and your things from your childhood. We all do. And it's just like the beauty of like living a life in the arts is you get to take that and work through it with your work. And so, I mean, that trip to New York was life changing for me.
Now, I wonder, just because you were talking specifically about Cezanne, I wonder what is it about that particular image or that particular moment that was so powerful? I mean, I love how you talked about it was something eternal, it was something sort of deep and spiritual. But I mean, of course, I have to pick it apart and sort of pick it to death and pin it down. What do you think it was about Cezanne in particular?
Well, what I really appreciated about Cezanne was, and I had an understanding of this, was like that it was not just a physical break of the picture plane, but there was a break of, and it was the beginning of modernity in the sense of like it was a break from the past, and that I could connect it to the rise of industrialization because I was interested in history. Things started connecting. It's like, oh, this is a visual representation of a shift in history, and that really interested me. And so when I could see that together, I think it was an aesthetic reaction to begin with, because I mean, just the color, like the oranges, and but I really love the idea of like, oh, this is what modernism is. It made total sense to me. Another thing was, I don't know why, I do not know why, but the painting that really made the biggest impact on me, two things. Malevich, is that his name? The Russian guy?
Yeah,
The red. Those Russian posters, that whole like Russian World War I sort of era hyper minimalism was, I loved it. I loved it. No, I never, and then I saw Joan Mitchell, loved it. I mean, this is 1920. 19 or 20. I didn't know anything about art history, but I would lock into these abstract images, and it was so liberating because I look back on it now and I never, ever asked, what does it mean? I just experienced it. I think some of that is person to person and subjective. I don't know why that is, but it was a wisdom there almost, where I didn't question it and I understood it in the sense of like, I understood it in the sense of like, this is enough. This red square is enough for me. And that was like 19 or 20.
Yeah, I mean, I love that for a lot of reasons. I think the thing that I'm excited about and that I'm thankful for is that you're both able to tap into the 19-year-old visceral response and the unlanguageable part of it, but then also you're able to look back at that and talk about it with your 2024 voice. I mean, to me, that's such a great gift, in terms of being able to think about those two experiences and then with all of your thought and with all of your consideration, bring those layers together. To me, that feels really great. Were there other things from that trip that were particularly impactful? There's, that's plenty to chew on with Cezanne and Malevich and Joan Mitchell.
Well, my dad was friends with this guy, John. Oh gosh, I can't think of his last name. I'm sorry, John. I mean, he's dead now, but and he was a actor, and he had this, and he lived in the Coldwater Flat in the Lower East Side, and this was in the 80s, next door to Hell's Angels, on the block where Hell's Angels were. So we walked up with all these motorcycles, and we go hang out with him, and in this where the bathtub was the sink was the bathtub and all of that. And it was like this old, everything was so old. It felt so 19th century. And it was. I mean, it was 19th century New York. And I kind of recognized that on some level. But he also, because he lived on the Lower East Side, it was all those punk stores, and there was like actual punks around. I mean, it was seeing it firsthand, and thrift stores. And we went in, we just went in all of them. And he just took me to them because he knew I was into the music. And he was this older man who was in the theater, and, he did commercials and voiceovers. And he was a struggling New York actor that my dad was very close to. So like my parents had friends that were sort of in their world that I would kind of lock into, and not to mention, like, gosh, I mean, the thing about Duck was, my dad and Duck were very close. I mean, it wasn't just like, oh, my uncle played in Booker T and the MGs. They were best friends until my uncle died. They talked on the phone every day, and they, and he went on. Duck moved out to California, and he played with everybody. He was a session musician. He played with so many people. They moved back to Memphis when I was a junior in high school. And I became obsessed with my one cousin, who was like one of the boys in my family who was like kind of nice to me, So I would hang out with him. Because I was the only girl. And so I was kind of like, they would just indulge me. Like, oh, God, okay, you can hang out. You can come sit in here. Yeah. But he was like, happy to see me. And so, of course, I loved him. And but he ended up dying in a car wreck. And that was just a real tragic sort of family event. And but all of that is to say that, like, there was so many people, like, in my world growing up that were like these sort of weird, not Catholic school, not businessy. Like, my dad was trying to live one life, but he also was surrounded by sort of artistic people, creative people, kind of weirdos, and so they were sort of around and would come in and out, and it was fluid, in that way. But going back to New York, I got a Swatch watch. That was a bubble Swatch watch. That seemed like a big deal, and it was a very hard time for my dad because he just started going to AA, and I remember he was going to meetings. So we would have to do everything like, okay, I'm going to go to this meeting. And he's going like 2 a day, and I'll never forget it. We stayed in this really old hotel, and it was just kind of crappy, flea baggy kind of hotel. And it had this 3-way mirror, like a vanity. And my dad walked out of the bathroom, and he forgot I was there, and he was naked. And I said, Dad. And then he walked in the bathroom, put on his clothes, and he sat down on the bed, and he just cried for a long time. Like, I can't believe I did that. I was like, that was like one of just like one every 3 days for a long time. He was just, I was this kid who just like trying to find myself. I should have been away at college. I couldn't, I was really, really trying to find my way, and my family was fractured at that sort of moment. And I took these art classes. I took 2 years of studio classes, Niles, Wallace. I took a class. I took all those people that were there at the school at the time.
Okay, so let's break those down one by one, if it's okay with you.
Sure.
So let's talk about Steve.
Well, Steve was intimidating, but he was such a softie that you were like, I really liked him. He was like, had that long hair, and he was rebellious and he was kind of like punk in a way. He was real kind of like, fuck you attitude to these students. He was like, do the work, don't do the work. He was a hard ass, like a throwback completely. But all those guys up there, him and Larry, all of them were, to me, what I considered myself but didn't know at the time, which was earnest and serious and took art very seriously and um and really, really was emotional about it. So it was a combination of seriousness and feelings of being like, and discipline. And I really got a lot from them from that. Like the idea of showing up, but I'm all, Larry telling, I'll never forget, I mean, God, that voice, and that storyteller sort of way about him was just so intense. And I'll never forget, like, he told this story about seeing a Rothko and crying in front of a Rothko. And I think he's probably told that story to every student he's ever had and every talk he's ever had. But I remember being a young woman hearing that and seeing somebody, not much older than my dad, really. I mean, and just being like, wow, I've never met a man like this. This is not, so I was, same with Steve Langdon, and then seeing someone like Melinda Parsons, who was an intellectual, and being around thinkers. That was the first time I was around thinking and critical thinking, and I couldn't get enough of it.
And for me, thinking about Steve, I mean, there's it was so fast. It was this one semester that I had him, and I remember him being really impactful, but I also remember that at the time I still thought of myself as a biology major, and I was really kind of doing this as a thing to kind of keep myself sane. And I remember I'm not sure if I remember him as being intimidating or imposing. I remember he would smoke a lot outside the class, or it was like at that moment they were no longer allowed to smoke in the class. And so I just remember him leaving the class a lot to go and smoke. And I remember, I'm not sure if I got his seriousness in this one particular moment. Like I remember in the class, we were doing just like continuous line, blind contour. And I remember it was not anything that I had done before. And I remember he came in and he told us to slow down. I know I've told you this story a million times, but like he told us to slow down. And then I remember being like, okay, yeah, all right, we're going to slow down. And I don't remember him walking around the room at all. Like that's something that I do a bunch, but I don't remember him walking around the room at all. And he would just kind of like look at us, and then he would say, no, I really want you to slow down. And then he would leave and smoke. And then he would come back in and he would say it again. And he'd be like, no, for real, I really want you to slow down. And then he'd say like, slow down so that you see everything. And then also so that you're seeing that real thing, that thing that's in front of you. And he said, maybe slow down so much that you're not really sure that your hand is moving. And then he would leave. And then I remember he came in and I don't know if it was just me that he picked out, but like I don't remember him doing this to anybody else. But he came over and he sat down, and like I got up and he sat down on that dumb drawing bench, and he drew the lip of a glass bottle. And I remember there was like a million different notes in that one line. Like I remember that he somehow got that Conte crayon to get like razor thin, and then fat, and then thin. And then I remember like the way that he drew the outside edge of that bottle and then pulled the outside edge in to make it feel like the lip of the bottle. And I remember just like saying, oh. And then I remember also saying, damn, he saw, like he sees all of that. Like, and there was this moment where I had to really reevaluate what it was that I saw and rethink the specificity of that thing. And I'm not totally sure that I remember anything other than that, aside from it was either that class or the next class or the next class. I remember leaving the classroom and feeling totally overwhelmed by the realization that all things are connected in our visual plane. Like there's no floating island. Like everything has something else that ties to it. And I remember sitting outside Jones Hall on one of those benches and not being able to see the whole world. I had to like concentrate on little tiny parts and how those little parts touched other things. But if I expanded my scope, it was overwhelming. And so I had to kind of concentrate almost to like induce a kind of tunnel vision. Mm-hmm. But I remember that thing so specifically. I probably remember that more than just about anything else in any other class from anybody else. But I remember that being really powerful. And then I remember after that, when I shifted into being an art major, I remember feeling sad that I didn't have Steve for any other class. And I remember also in the moment being keenly aware that I was still underachieving and not taking advantage of the facilities there with me. And it was after that I shifted to try and take advantage of everything that was there. Mm-hmm. And I sort of regret or wish in hindsight that I had taken or had more experiences with Steve. Was that the only class that you had with him?
I feel like I took a figure class with him, but I can't really remember. But I remember, his still life setups were so simple. I mean, they're just bottles. I mean, it was very simple, but that whole feeling of the spotlight and sitting on those chairs, or what do you call them, the horses, yeah. And the feeling, the tactile feeling of everything in there, and that I do have a distinct memory of doing something in him, and it just being so, because at that point, because I really had not, it was my first time drawing, my eye-hand coordination was just not there at all, and he would come over and just do this thing, and it was just like so expert. It just felt so fluid, and we had to do this book, I still have it, of 20 master copies, and that was really made a huge impression on me. Like, I can remember so many of those drawings. I wasn't really a proficient drawer, but I knew that one thing I did realize pretty early on in those classes was like, they don't really care if you're a good artist. They just want you to try. And so if you show that you try and you care, that's going to go a long way. So I really locked into that, and then I just was like, oh, I'm going to do these minimalist things. I'm going to do things that are like, just like, like little Japanese drawings and stuff. And he gave me, I got a B on it. I'll never forget. But I did this one drawing of it was a little track drawing of a printmaker. It was a quick gestural drawing of somebody at a printing press. And I saw that at MoMA. And I just couldn't believe I was standing in front of it. And so that was a big, that class and that book in particular, it made an object that was like my first sketchbook. That was like really my first sketchbook, was those master copies. And I really loved that. And then of course there was Bonnie Beaver.
Right. No. Well, let's go to Bonnie Beaver then. And so what was interesting about Bonnie?
Well, Bonnie was just one of those, I feel like that I'm Bonnie Beaver now. I mean, like this middle-aged woman, strange lady, the strange older lady, and I just always imagined her living alone, and she made me connect to the idea that source material is everywhere. And we had to do the exercise where you bring in like your junk drawer and draw it. And so the still life was just bring whatever's in your junk drawer. And we put it like on a white piece of paper and just kind of dumped it. And then she went around. She goes, look, see the colors of your clothes, and look, the colors here, they're all the same. Or the, what do you have? Oh, you have metal, and you have this, and oh, and you have, it was just like a way of like, it was an identity project, like that. Oh, wait, my objects and the things that I have around me are a reflection of who I am as a person, and that the simplest things in life could actually be inspiration for art and source material. And she would do weird things like projections on still lifes, and so, which nothing radical, just like at the time those seemed very weird and experimental, and she seemed so and then also all the art supplies. Like that whole thing of like Elizabeth Alley and I always talk about like the way that the having the multidisciplinary drawing practice is a direct result of taking a Bonnie Beaver class.
Right. It's funny. I remember that more than anything else about Bonnie Beaver was that anything was fair game. Yeah. And she was just like, here's a spray bottle. Or she'd be like, okay, check this out. Here's some salt. Or she'd be like, check this out. Here goes some, we're going to put some plastic down on this. And then she'd be like, okay, now what about this? What if you tried this? Well, could you do some collage? And everybody else, like Larry and Dick and Niles and Nancy, were much more like, well, this is ceramics and this is painting, but with Bonnie, what really was, she was and she was also kind of nutty. In ways that I don't think any of our other teachers were. I mean, she was very nutty, and then I also kind of remember her, she would just have stacks and stacks of books, and she would sort of lay books out. Like, I don't necessarily remember any of her slide presentations. Larry was the one that I remember the most for slide presentations, because he really would construct those. It was like, you could tell it was almost like a project, where he was like, and this one leads into this one. But with Bonnie, it was like she would just have this stack of books, and then she would reach and grab them, and she would scrape into the watercolor, and she would use resist, and it would just be, she would have 1,000 things at her disposal, and it was so expansive in ways that at 1980s University of Memphis, it just wasn't expansive.
And then he'd inevitably make these very messy drawings, which was uncomfortable. And the messier and crazier it was, the more she's like, "Oh, that's so great," So just, yeah, she was a very much an outlier in that department. I felt like, I mean, everybody seemed to get along okay, but you could tell she was in her own world, and it was her world, and I really, really liked that. And then I did take classes from Niles. I took and Nancy, and of course, Niles was like, everybody had a crush on Niles because he was, I mean, I'd tell this to his face. He was so handsome.
It's funny, like with Niles, I feel like I experienced Niles in his like clearly burnout phase. And Niles was there for like 40 years. And so I think he had several of those. But like when I was working with him, I just remember, I think the main time I worked with Niles was in 3D design. 2D design. And I just remember like he was just like, somebody would come in and be like, well, yeah, this is a circle, but it's really just squares that are spinning. And the Niles was like, but the assignment was to like use squares. And then the guy would say something like that, and then he would be like, whatever.
Yeah.
And he would just like not at all worry about it. And so like mostly I remember Niles in that way. But then I didn't have classes with him, but I remember Niles had, in that 5 years that I was there, worked himself out of that burnout and was really alive in the ceramics room in ways that I had never seen anybody that alive. But you remember him as being really handsome. But do you remember anything in particular about his classes?
Well, I remember that sort of like, I'm going to teach you and I'm going to show you this, and I'm not going to really, but I'm also not going to it's not a nonchalance. There was something about him that was a detachment as a teacher that I really liked. Like, he seemed to have his own world. He didn't seem to care so much about, like, he cared about the students, but he also seemed to be able to, like, to me, he seemed like somebody's like, this guy's got a life somewhere going on. Like, I don't know. Like, I will say that, I did eventually drop out of school, and I remember going to him, and I mean, I dropped out in the middle of the semester and had like 4 Fs on my, it was very self-destructive, kind of like burn it down, And I remember going to him and telling him, like, look, I'm moving to Chicago. And he looked at me like, I don't know, I can't say what he was thinking, but the vibe I got was like, you have to destroy yourself to build yourself back up. I'm not going to get in your way. It wasn't like, oh, you shouldn't do this or that's not good. It was just like, you do what you need to do. It's your life. That's what he was that guy, Like, and I really like that about him. I have a very deep affection for Niles. I see him in Kroger a lot. We joke all the time, like, I'll see you in Kroger, and we'll stand there and have half-hour conversations, at 10 in the morning, Anyway, so I consider him like a colleague now, and he's still that same person. Like you can, yeah, he's that guy, It's like, whatever, I kind of love that about him,
Right. Now, thinking about that, so what about, so you were saying Melinda Parsons, and then what were the classes that you had with Larry?
I had color and a couple of painting classes.
No, I had Ken Wong for color. What do you remember about in terms of Larry and Larry's color fundamentals class?
I just remember, I don't really honestly remember a lot. I remember it being a really fun class. Like, I kind of liked the order of it. I mean, I wasn't the color part of it was very hard at the time. I wasn't like I was naturally good. But, I just remember it being like really fun. And I liked his personality. He made it fun. He just was like, he clearly loved teaching. I mean, I just remember that being a really fun class. And that's where I remember him talking about Rothko. And, but I did actually start hanging out at the time with MCA kids or Art Academy kids at the time, because there was this whole music scene. There's this whole Midtown band and tennis club scene that I was also involved in. So I had one foot in the U of M door and I had one foot in the MCA door. And I actually tried to get into MCA and did a portfolio and the whole thing. And I got in, but I ended up leaving town, so it didn't happen. But
now, who do you remember in terms of thinking about that community? I mean, you were talking about hanging out with MCA kids. Were there people in particular that you remember being kind of important to you?
Yeah, I mean, it was this band called The Odd Jobs, which was this guy, Robert Fordyce, Mark Gooch, Gary Bacchus, who is a graphic designer, and Diane Green, who lives in Chicago now and is still playing music and making art. All of them are still making art. And I remember going to see them play. And I was like, oh, wow, this is the kind of music I've been listening to, and I'm seeing it live. This is art. This is an art band. This is an art school band. Oh my God, this is an actual art school band. And I just locked in, started dating one of the guys in the band. And it was just like, oh boy, that was like, they really, really, really spent a lot of time with those guys.
No,
but
what was it that made them an art school band?
Because
I was
they were
totally
like,
not there.
Because they were wearing the clothes. The music was super experimental. It was like Laurie Anderson-esque. It was meets Frank Zappa meets the blues. I mean, it was like this hodgepodge of like things that were in the outside world and things that were local. This guy Stoughton Outland was in the band too, and they could actually play. And they could sing, and they were good. They were really, really good. And we would just dance and dance and dance. And, so I had started going to the Antenna Club when I was a senior in high school, really, and because you could just get in. And that scene was at the time, was very queer. It was also, but we didn't know that's what it was called then. I mean, in the sense of like, it was very new wave. So it was a lot of like gender fluid people hanging out, and it was like it changed over time and got more hardcore, and that obliterated the feminine side of the punk rock scene. But at the Antenna Club at the time would have TVs in the corner, and they'd play all these music videos of all the bands that MTV would not play, which were like, these, Gang of Four and all of these like British bands that we were listening to. And so that there was also Decadence Manor, which was and I mean, Jimbo walking into that, he walked downstairs in a dress. I'd never seen a man in a dress. I don't think I'd really ever hung out with a gay man before. And I just felt so like, I just remember like feeling like ease, like my shoulders just got softer, and like I just unclenched my jaw, and was like, oh my God, this place. I hung out there so much in that old house on Madison, and around all those clothes, which were really from the 40s and 50s. Those clothes it was the 80s, so those clothes were, and we were all dressing like that way. Like I just only wore vintage clothes. And I mean, aesthetically, it was like a very full, it wasn't just the art, it was the music, it was dance. I was dancing all the time. It was the clothes, it was the hair, it was everything,
Now, what were you playing?
Well, at the time I wasn't really playing any music. I still play guitar, and I was like kind of would noodle around by myself, and I never I just kind of knew how to play like 5 or 6 chords on the guitar, and I was kind of proficient, but I wasn't that great, and I just kind of hid it away and everything. But boy, did I sing by myself all the time, and I listened to music constantly, and went to go hear bands constantly. So I was just really, everything was soaking in. Then, but at the same time, it's like, wow, I'm just looking over here at this wall. Like, there's Booker T. Jones, and then there's Greg Cartwright, and there's like all these people, but on the wall, I was like hanging out with this Midtown music scene at the time in the mid '80s, and going. There's all these warehouse parties downtown with the Panther Burns and that whole scene, and Hellcats and that lineage of musicians, and I had gotten my first apartment and was living in my apartment by myself, and going to school, and had a little part-time jobs and doing that. And, I never I never had the college life. I was always a commuter kid. I was always and then I went up to the Antenna Club on a Wednesday night. They would have a beer bus, like for $5. You could drink as much beer as you want. And I met this guy who was from Chicago, and he was just coming through town, and he ended up staying with me for like 3 months. And my family life, was so fraught, and everything was so broken, and I was a pretty wounded person, and there was this person, I met somebody who was showing me and he was a guitar player, and we started playing guitar together, and we were listening. He was exposing me to a lot of like old blues and a lot of 50s stuff that I didn't know about. It was exposing me to a lot of things. And then I ended up dropping out of college and just moving to Chicago, and I lived there for 3 years.
Okay. Nope. Oh, that is so good. Let me backtrack just a little bit. So thinking about that, what was the atmosphere like when you were hanging out and talking with the MCA kids? I don't think I had any overlaps with MCA at all, and so that's totally alien to me. So what was that like in terms of it? Was it similar to the U of M vibe, or was it wholly different?
It felt really different because their classes were all day. Mm-hmm. That was like, what? I mean, it seemed like to me like that was the legit thing. Like looking back, I know that it wasn't, but at the time it seemed, and also just like there was a lot of mythology around a lot of those teachers, and like John McIntyre, and because I was hanging out with Mark Gooch, he had taken sculpture from him, and Ian Schneller, who went on to move to Chicago. Now he's got this big speaker company today, and he studied with him, and like these, and then of course, there's so many, all the painters, Vita, like everybody, there was like such a mythology around those teachers in a way that, and it was kind of a grass is greener thing. Like I just felt like, that was the thing I needed to do. Like it seemed like a better fit at the time. I knew, looking back, I know it wasn't really, but and those guys a lot of those guys had already graduated. So like I was 21 and 22, and a lot of them were like 25, 26, 27. So it was like they had, so they had this lure about the school too, But it's interesting because that time that I wanted to go to the school was the time when MCA was slowly starting to come apart internally. And that is really at that time, like that, people were like, how did MCA close? Why did MCA close? It's like, that was a slow death. And I remember very clearly, like, people complaining at the time, like, oh boy, this school is changing so much. This was in the 80s, like things had shifted.
Now, what do you, in terms of thinking about community, I mean, I know that's such a huge part of how I think about you. Who were some of the people at University or Memphis State at the time? Who were some of the people there that were your cohorts that were important for you?
Oh, gosh. I didn't really hang out with a lot of the other students. It was kind of more when I came back to the U of M after Chicago where I really locked in. There was this young Spanish guy. There was these two guys, and oh gosh, I cannot think of their names. One was a Chinese guy and one was a Spanish guy. Like somehow I was like hanging out with these first generation kids. And oh gosh, it makes me sad I can't remember their names. But I remember that was very cool. And Christy Duckworth, I was hanging out with her. And but it was when I came back in like 90, that's when I met you and Libby Pace and Eric Schwartz and all of those people who were in the art department at the time. And because I was already kind of knew these people from the music scene. So it was this overlap. But but those first couple of years, like when I was like at the U of M, Misty White and Christy, those people, and Randy Ranke, there was this whole group of people. They were all studying like philosophy and stuff like that, which was very interesting to me too. So in the art school, I mean, I was kind of going to class, going to work, going to hear bands. I wasn't really hanging out with other art students that much.
Now, you were talking about going to Chicago, and I know that's a pretty important part of your story. I'm curious, what was it that made you decide to go to Chicago? You were talking about
it was a guy.
A guy.
Yeah.
And so what did that look like?
Well, he was working at the Schwinn bike shop on summer. Like he was a bike mechanic. And so he stayed here for like 3 months. He stayed with me in my apartment. We had, kind of it was like a whirlwind kind of affair kind of feel. Like it was like really, I moved up there, and what it looked like was like me just doing the thing that most kids had already done like 3 years before. I flew the coop and was finding my wings and like just now like learning how to go off in the world on my own, and the scene in Chicago was the people who would like go on to be Tortoise, and like it was those guys. I mean, it was like an incredible music scene. It was like 11th Dream Day and all these Chicago bands, the late 80s. We were like we were rooming with like a few of them, and I was kind of involved in a music scene up there that I'm still friends with a couple of those people. And it's like, you know, now they're like the elder statesmen of the Chicago music scene. So it was very cool. I didn't end up staying with this guy, you know, like we were together like 6 months, but I ended up getting an apartment with this woman named Rebecca Ripple, who was the first person who was actually a working artist. And it was an apartment above a shoe store. And she was a sculptor. And she was making stuff out of pantyhose and bones and, you know, like kind of Louise Bourgeois type inspired art, you know. And she just graduated from college, and she went to college in New York. What's that big ceramic school in upstate?
Alfred.
She went to Alfred. So it was like, and she was, but she grew, it's like, so it was like this person who was like, I was meeting so many people from so many different walks of life, right? And so she rented me a room in the back, but her whole thing was like, I got a job that I can work 4 days a week so I can make art 3 days a week. And she would set her alarm every morning, make art before she went to work. She would swim every day. She was like not that much older than me, but I saw what discipline in an art practice looked like. And it was very intriguing. And at the same time, I started busking in the subways, in the tunnels. And that's when I really sort of developed, because I would just play the same 3 songs over and over again, you know, and I would make pretty decent money. I mean, I would, you know, use it at the bar, but it was like, but there was like it was a time, and I worked for a ceramic artist the whole time I was there as his assistant. I figure modeled at the Art Institute for 2 years, completely lied and said I'd done it in Memphis and never done it ever. But that's where I got an art. Really the best art school education I got was in those classes as a figure model, because I would listen to what the teacher was saying, and felt completely removed from the kids in the class. Though I'm locked in with the teacher. The kids seemed like very I was their age. I was working 3 jobs. I was living in an apartment. They were not that much older than me, or the same, about my age, and they just seemed very entitled to me, you know. But you know, they came from families who like nurtured them, and then, you know, now I know what it was. But at the time, I was kind of snobby towards. I mean, there were some that were nice, but I was kind of like, remove myself. There's a powerful position being the figure model in a class. Like, you really own a space.
Tell me about that.
Well, you're nude, and I was their age. So I had to really, really, really muster up a lot of courage to do that. But once I did it the first time, I just remember thinking, what wasn't I liked in a figure model? And the figure model that I always had at the U of M was, oh gosh, I can't think of her name. She was blonde. She worked at Maggie's farm. She had long blonde hair. She died of cancer. Did you know what I'm talking about? She was so cool, and I just loved her. And so I just really tried to embody her, which was like a lot of self-confidence. But I would do these grad student classes or senior thesis or grads classes where it would be like a 6-week painting. So you would go in twice a week and hold the same, you know, usually be on a couch, and like sometimes it'd be me and 2 other people, and we would just, and I would get to know the other models, and like we would have the same pose because they would do a long painting of it, you know. And so I learned so much doing that. And then oh my gosh, I'm having a moment with a name. Who is the Black artist, political artist, who's oh my gosh, where you walked over a flag to get to it and you signed the book. It was at the Art Institute.
Oh yeah. Was it?
His name is an historical figure.
Yeah, right.
And he just spoke at Rhodes a few years ago, and I can't think of his name.
Yeah.
It begins with a D.
I was totally about to say it. But yes, I know who you're talking about.
Well, you'll have to cut that out because that's just embarrassing. But he was there when I was there. Like I was like going through Vietnam vet protest. Like that was happening while I was there.
Oh wow!
So it was
Dred Scott.
okay. You could just cut that. You could just cut that part out because this is a good story. Like, so when I was there, that's when Dred Scott was in graduate school, and so and he did that seminal piece where there was a book on a podium, I believe, but you had to walk over the American flag to say, what does this mean to you? And you'd write in the book what the flag means to you, but you had to step on the flag in order to do it. And so I remember going to the Art Institute and there being, hundreds of Vietnam vets protesting this, it was the time when flag burning was very radical. And it was just, it was a really cool time to be there. And the reason I got the job was there was a guy that was worked in the kinetic sculpture department who was an electrician who was from Memphis and was part of that whole scene back when the odd job scene like in Memphis, and he had gotten a job there and he hooked me up with Zelda, the lady that was who would book the gigs for the modeling, but also going to the Art Institute, the museum. I went all the time. Spent a lot of time in there, and that was a big deal. And I would go to the music box and watch movies all the time. I worked at this place called Facets Multimedia, which was like the first Netflix where you would rent art films, and it was a giant catalog. And boy, that office, they needed to make a sitcom about that because that was a bunch of misfits working in there. It was great. Like, I really lived life. Like, it was before gentrification. Things were just starting to gentrify. Like, the old Polish ladies were dying off and everything. I was getting priced out of neighborhoods constantly. Like, I would have to move like every 6 months because my $250, $300 rent, somebody'd buy the house and then it would double, triple in price. So it was right on the cusp of being able to live in a large American city as a young adult and have a couple of part-time jobs and an apartment and live the city life. It was the last gasp of that in America, and I got it.
So we're totally fine. We're not gonna get too much further. But I want to stick.
I could just keep going.
I'm totally happy with that. But I like how you were like, and then I was in Chicago, and then blah 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 blah, and then you just like kept going. Well, hang on, we'll just slow it down. So
sorry.
That's totally fine. You're doing so good.
And I'm not even 25 yet. Okay.
And I told you most of these will get up to like high school in the first 2 hours, and so you're already way ahead of everybody. But let me just sort of slow down and back up a little bit, just because I think you've talked so much and so beautifully about art and seeing art in New York when you were there with your dad. But I'm curious, Chicago really is for many people sort of the first place where they see art in the flesh and they are in that space, and it is so powerful. And so I'm curious, what was it like being there at the Art Institute and having access to it and seeing things, and what was it that you saw?
Well, I'll be honest, I can't remember a specific show that completely blew my mind. What I remember was just learning the collection, and just the experience, the museum experience. I've got an hour, because it was free. You could just walk in, and I'm just going to go walk through this or walk through that, and the marble steps, and just the feeling of being in a museum has always made me feel good. And I just, that's what I remember about it more than anything. Yes, there's all the art in there, and it also helped me understand art history. It helped me learn art history and just go, okay, I'm going to go from ancient, and then I'm going to go here, and then going to go here and go here. And then, I would linger a lot more in the Van Gogh's. And I remember at the time I was just really into that I really loved that. And then learning, and then slowly going into more 20th century stuff. But just it was less about specific artwork and more about the experience of learning about the history of art in person over time, and people watching and sitting on a bench and the quiet, and just and it being a time, it was a different time, like there was no cell phones in the museum. It had like kind of, it was very quiet. It was just people were having, it was a place where you could have an introspective experience with humanity, with other people. I certainly was turning my back on all of the religion I learned, but it had that feeling of being with strangers in a place where you are celebrating something that was bigger than you.
And now, what about the rest of the city in terms of art?
Well, in terms of art, like I remember slowly going to art shows and dibble dabbling in the art world. It seemed extremely foreign to me and very scary. It seemed very you know, just like something out of a movie. Like these people are a lot older than me. They dress completely like they've got lots of money. I mean, of course, now looking back, it was not that at all. But it was just people having art shows. But at the time, it just seemed like I was kind of afraid of it. I liked the work, and having Rebecca Ripple as my roommate, we would go to art shows, and she would show me the art world in a way of like, no, I mean, because she was a very down to earth person, but she was doing this very, very sort of feminist, radical work, and yeah, it so I kind of had an understanding of it. And I just had to remember something that I forgot to tell you, and that is I had to write about a woman artist in high school for something, and I went to the library and I found a book on Judy Chicago's The Dinner Table. And I don't know why I really gravitated to that, but I wrote a whole paper about it in high school, not ever really taking an art history class or an art class. So when I got to around Rebecca and stuff, I saw visual clues. Like I understood what she was doing a little bit. It made sort of sense to me in a way. But so yeah, as far as other art in the city, and of course, it was such a mixed city. Like there were so many. It was a huge Mexican population, huge Polish population. It was a time when all the things in Central America were happening, and there's just all this that coming out of like CIA involvement in El Salvador, and like the idea of torture. I remember that was like, what? How could this happen? It was very much like I was a very political person. I was very political in high school. I don't know how that happened. I was very no nukes was a real big deal to me. I would watch debates. I mean, now, like, compared to what I was at the time, I know I'm going back and forth, but I thought I kind of thought I wanted to go into like public service of some kind, which now that's hilarious, but it's like, I don't know. I think it was all that thing of like, I was trying to figure out how things worked, and I didn't understand. They used to have this thing on Channel 5. If you ask me, did you ever?
Oh, I know about that. Yeah.
I did that because Miss Ring was like, you should get Melissa to do it, and I was like, if you ask me, the Equal Rights Amendment is just the first step. Blah 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 blah. Like it was like I was like a little feminist. Like my parents were like very apolitical and uneducated. I don't know where the feminism came from, but I was kind of born that way. Like I was like always pointing out like this doesn't make sense, And so when I got to Chicago, it was like the world itself was reflected in the city. The city was just very, I mean, I was listening to Terry Gross then, the Chicago NPR station was amazing. And me and the Potter, Sam Ross, we listened to it all the time. So I was and there was like, it was a blue collar town. It was a union town. It was, up against like Reaganism, and so it was very much It was kind of a great time to be sort of like a politically minded young person in a way. Just keep going on and on.
Man, all of that is so good. I mean, I kind of want to stay in Chicago just a little tiny
Sure,
bit.
we can do whatever you want, Hamlet. I'm having a really great time, like blabbing on about all this stuff because it's like I keep it so private, like it's all like sort of in there. You don't think about these things, you don't access these things, and then when you do, it's like volcanic.
So with Chicago, talk to me a little bit about the music that was going on there.
Well, it was annoying because none of those Chicago kids danced. And I came from a tradition of Memphis at the Antenna Club where we all danced. Well, until the hardcore kids came in, and then you couldn't dance anymore because it was a mosh pit. But before that, it was a dance party, And so I was usually frustrated at Chicago shows. So I mean, I liked the Chicago scene, but I was kind of like looked my nose down at it because I was like, y'all have no soul, no rhythm. Like you don't know this is a perfectly danceable song, and you're just standing there with your arms crossed. I don't understand who you are. Like who are you people? Like that. It just made me so crazy. It made me nuts.
Now, did you find the community there? I mean, were you were talking about busking and going to see shows and stuff.
Yeah.
Was it, and then also just kind of thinking about Chicago and the art community, people often describe it as kind of insular, and you kind of have to be from there in order to be connected to it. But what about with music?
Well, with music, I was, I played one show, I think, but I hung out with, there was this band called Freakwater, which was a duo country band. They were my buds. So that was those two women, and particularly, well, it's interesting because one woman, Kathy, she and I we worked in the same restaurant together up in North Shore suburb, Winnetka, and we worked in the same restaurant together. Janet worked there too, but not as long. And they were roommates, and I would hang out with them all the time. And now Janet and I are pretty close. And like I've gone to see her and visit her just like in like the last year. Like we're good friends now. Kathy, we're very close like in our hearts, but like I'm actually hanging out with Janet in a way. It's so funny. She just turned 60. She had a big birthday party.
Now, if I remember right, I think we might have talked about this already. My friend Dylan worked in Chicago at a law firm, and he has like a master's or a PhD in rhetoric. And so when he was there working for that law firm, his job basically was to make sure that the legal document said the thing that they were supposed to say. Yeah. And if I remember right, he worked with Janet.
Well, Janet, yeah, I think she's might be a paralegal.
Yeah. So that's the Venn diagram overlap with me and you and Freakwater.
Yeah, that's so funny. I also worked at a restaurant that was run by young women in mid-20s, a little bit older than me. They bought this restaurant called Leo's Lunchroom, and it was just a little 3-table diner with a counter. I mean, it was like, could have been 1945 when you walked in there, and didn't change anything. And they had a big impact on me because it was all run by women. It was very... they were all just so badass, and I just remember. I was a waitress there, and I loved that. That was a great scene. That was we all went to got in a van and went to Jazz Fest in New Orleans together, and that was cool. I didn't like Jazz Fest, but I shouldn't say that. I'm not good at crowds, and I hid. I went and there was a bookseller, and I just got a book and went in the stands and read the whole day. And then when we met back at the van, they were all completely sunburned, and they were like, "You hid, didn't you?" And I was like, "I did." But nothing against Jazz Fest or the music. Of course, I love it. I just couldn't deal with the crowd.
What were some things in terms of thinking about Chicago and where Chicago kind of fits in your life and kind of in your story? Were there things that you feel like that you took away from that experience that were particularly important?
Well, yeah, I mean, for one thing, I learned how to, have the experience of people meeting you where you are, not like, oh, you are from Memphis, or where did you go to high school, or like, who are your parents, or where do you, like it, Memphis is such a small town. Like, so if you stay in Memphis and go to U of M or Memphis State or whatever, you're never going to get away from, so it's kind of like I had the college experience without going to college. I learned how to hustle work. Like I felt like at the time I could get a job. Like if I lost a job, I'd get the job because I would just do anything. I learned how to get an apartment. I learned how to be an adult pretty much on my own. Made bunches of mistakes and screwed up, but and there's a lot of but it was also like there was a lot of self-destruction. There's a lot of that. But it was also very. I think the thing that I brought back with me was I had an inner city experience, which was the ability to be in a big city and navigate a train, walk everywhere. Like I've never had that since. I'll probably never have it again as far as a place to live, because it's just I couldn't afford it now. Like I couldn't live, but I loved living in a city. I really liked it. So I got to have that. I got to have a real city experience and meet people that were just so different from the people I grew up around. So it was kind of like a college experience in that regard.
Now, last thing, maybe before we hit the spot, talk about the things that you felt like you learned from the teachers at Art Institute when you were there as a model. I'm curious about that. Like you were saying that you connected more with them.
I just remember them, like somehow I was able to get in on these classes, and it would be like, you would do a pose, but then we'd go and they do a slideshow somewhere, and like in the other room or something like that. And I'd be like, can I come in? And I would go in. They would let me, they kind of knew my story. They were like, why aren't you in school? And I'm like, well, da, da, da. And they kind of took me under their wing, a couple of them, And so I just remember them talking about like the way to build something slowly over time, like, and just being around something that it took time to make an artwork, especially those longer classes. I can't specifically say like exactly what that was, except to say that like but you have to understand the Art Institute to me seemed completely inaccessible. It was like, yeah, it may have been Harvard or Yale. Like I was never going to get in there. I could never afford it. I would never be able to get in even if I tried. My transcripts from U of M were destroyed, as far as like my grade point average, because I've dropped out. Like I was in a mess. Like, I had like $500 of parking tickets at U of M. Like I say that I learned how to be an adult, but it was by just being so bad at being an adult. Like I just taught. So I did try to get into University of Illinois Circle campus. Like I talked to them about doing that, and I thought maybe I could go to school here. But one thing I did learn in Chicago was I can't do real cold, long winters. Like that's just, after the third one, my dad had gone on a road trip. He had a truck at the time. He was going up to Minneapolis to drop off some light fixtures, and he came through town and yeah, that was I got really depressed, real sad. Like I got real like clinically depressed, and I was smoking and drinking a lot, and I was trying to get help though. Like I did like find a social worker where I could get like free therapy, because I knew like maybe that thing had come home to roost that I thought about before all those years. Like maybe it was time to figure some stuff out. And at the time I was like really trying to quit smoking cigarettes, and I couldn't. And so I took this bus down to the south side. It was like 3 buses and 2 trains. And I finally found this therapist, and we sit down, and I had not smoked for a few days. And I was actually there just to talk about, I thought I was going to talk about smoking, and she sat down, and this was at the time when people still smoked, and she says, do you mind if I smoked? And I said, I said, no, can I have one? And we sat there and smoked cigarettes, and I never talked to her about smoking. And we just smoked, like, we did the thing that I was there to try to get help with, which was sort of indicative of, like, kind of my childhood in my 20s. I was like, I wanted help with things, but it felt like that I could never really quite get the help I needed. But I did eventually, you know.
Now, was that kind of the time where you were beginning to think about this this thing that you mentioned earlier, where eventually I'm gonna learn to adult?
Yeah, I think that definitely was a time when I was like really, I was really trying to, you know, become a person, like trying to figure out who I was and what I wanted to be and what I wanted to do, and I really just had no idea, you know. And so I was just taking it day by day in the sense of like I just was working these jobs and just doing the thing, and finally when my dad showed up, he saw how sad I was, and it was like in November and the winter was coming and everything, and a lot like other things in life, like the way I grew up was like, well, let's just pack it up and go. Like we're just gonna, you know, let's just leave. And that's pretty much what I did. I just like packed up the apartment, got my cat, came back to Memphis, and ended up moving in this warehouse across the street from Commercial Appeal called the Sad Pad. Me and like 4 guys, and my parents were appalled that I lived there. And it was like, that's when I met Libby and went back to U of M eventually. And
Okay,
that's all.
let's stop there.
The Sad Pad.
And that was the first of 2 interviews with Melissa Dunn. It was recorded on February 24th, 2024. Please tune in next week. Spoiler alert, it's going to be part 2 of 2 interviews with Melissa Dunn. Until then, thank you for listening.